we continue to get at our story from different perspectives. The next presenter will cover the geopolitical consequences of the battle from the perspective of America, and I believe even the different parts of America, as well as New Orleans, which might all have done different things. And so it'll be presented by Ron Chapman, who you know well, who gave our general overview lecture, great friend to the symposium, has done it, the whole symposium was dedicated to him this year. And I'll present to you Mr. Chapman with the American side.
I think Tim summed it up best. Historians hesitate to talk about what could have been, but quietly we do. We always wonder what might have happened. And so when I was asked to do this, I got to thinking about it, and I said, well, you know, there really is quite a bit at stake here. So this is all fantasy. I want you to be aware of that. But let's see what we have here. So what are the geopolitical consequences of the United States had we lost? Okay? I need somebody to advance this thing. Where's Sam? It's not talking. Excuse me. It's talking now. I guess you have to walk away from it. Okay, this was the Second War of Independence. Benjamin Franklin, I believe, at one point said after the American Revolution it would probably take a second battle in order to secure American independence, and some argued that the War of 1812 was indeed that. It wasn't so much that America was about to be conquered again, it was a question of affirming what had already taken place. The British accepted, after 1812, the independence of the United States, though I have friends of mine from England who still refer to us as the colonies. So there's a persistence there, nevertheless. And also the world would now accept the United States as an independent nation. It affirmed itself because right after the American Revolution, the idea of an independent democratic nation was unique. And could it persist? Would it survive? That not only was a question within Europe, it was a question within the United States itself, especially as the issue of can we transfer power peaceably from one administration to another, which is an interesting thing to consider in today's environment. You know, we've done it successfully up to this point in time. Next, American victory militarily resonated. This was Wellington's army. This was the army that defeated Napoleon, and yet somehow they got defeated by, I don't really know if you can refer to Jackson's conglomeration of different elements as a true army. I mean, effectively it worked as one, but it wasn't a disciplined army per se, and none other than Frederick III of Prussia was very curious as to how it was that the Americans were able to achieve this great victory on the battlefield against a splendid British army that had done so much. The issue of democracy we have to consider. When you realize that, and I tell my students this all the time, that the concept of democracy coming up in America was something that hadn't really existed outside of perhaps a few cantons in Switzerland, since the collapse of the Greek Republic or the Roman Republic. Up to that time, we have been under the rule of kings or dictators or what have you. The idea of people, and if you read the Declaration of Independence, there's an incredibly powerful argument. The idea of people gathering together and deciding by contract to arrange their own government, to govern themselves, and then sit down and compose a constitution which will establish the balance of powers to perpetuate the sense of independence, was unique and had to be preserved. How it would have survived a defeat in the War of 1812 and the consequences of that is a question that, again, should be considered. Many wondered if democracy could survive, and think about that. After the War of 1812, those questions were no longer out there. America had preserved itself, America was persistent, America was strong. The American influence grows over the years. If you sit down and you consider it, the American democracy has become a model. The American Constitution and Declaration of Independence has become a model. Over the years, we're only talking 200 years. Over 200 years, monarchies are virtually gone. Where you have them, they're more figureheads and effective forms of government. It's become the persistent theme. And it's sprung from this taproot here in the United States. And it's a very delicate thing, democracy. It's very quick and easy to lose if you don't maintain it. And that's why it's so important that we respect the tenets of what we're about, okay? Now, the loss in Chalmette might have changed the entire course of not only American history, but if you speculate and fantasize, as Tim would say, perhaps the world's. Let's look at it. First of all, had they taken New Orleans and repudiated the Louisiana Purchase, which they intended to do, and going back to what Chris had mentioned, it's true. In a treaty, they don't specifically mention Louisiana. If I'm not mistaken, the Americans thought they were talking about islands off the coast of Maine. The idea was its rightful owner. The rightful owner of Louisiana was Spain. It was stolen property, just like a stolen car. It belongs to the person who holds the title. If you paid for it, you lose it, you made a mistake. So this was the deal here. Had America was in debt, so could we have bought it if it was offered? Probably not. And secondly, I doubt seriously if England would have allowed the sale, because England would have been the force that was securing it. In this situation, you have England and Canada, England and New Orleans, absolute control of the Mississippi River. You also have the Native Americans now have a safe place to go because they've allied with the British, especially in the War of 1812, but also in the American Revolution. They've suffered heavily for this. They were guaranteed land west of the Mississippi River secured by the British Army. Another thing to consider is this, the Industrial Revolution. It begins in England with the woolens industry, but the thing they really wanted was cotton. But you can't get the seeds out of cotton until Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. Once he invents the cotton gin, this becomes very important. And after the War of 1812, the South's control of this is similar to OPEC's control of oil in the 1970s. Imagine if England could have controlled the Mississippi River, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, and all the trade that comes from west of the Appalachian Mountains. This would have become invaluable as an economic entity. Always consider economics, okay? Next, with the protected the Army, we talked about that, would have not been available. New states. We talked about the idea that we were not really a union tied together to really after the Civil War. The issue of states' rights and states were perceived to be a confederation. That was the whole federalist, anti-federalist struggle that to some extent continues this day. How big will the federal government get? Suppose the British did control the Mississippi River. What happens to those states and those territories west of the Appalachian Mountains? There are no railroads. There's no way to get through those mountains. They were economically dependent upon the water trade of the Mississippi River. It's entirely possible the western states might have had to secede to join in whatever entity that was that controlled that waterway. We don't know. So considering that, what would be the impact on American history as we go down the line? With no territories left for expansion. Because remember, the whole American spirit is predicated on the idea of Western expansion, that concept of manifest destiny. We should occupy a continent from one ocean to the other. So when you consider it, what about the issue of slavery? The problem and the question of slavery was the expansion of slavery into the territories. If we had no territories to expand into, what would have happened with that issue? Would have just stayed the way it was with a divided America along the East Coast, a small country? Would it have separated into two separate countries over the irreconcilable issue and moral issue and economic issue of slavery and tariffs? We really don't know. Okay? Could northern unity be maintained? Would America have ever become a continental power when you consider that? So if you look at the map, you're talking about taking out the entire area here of Louisiana Purchase. It was like dominoes falling. You know, first you have the Louisiana Purchase, 1803. Spain here, Florida, Andrew Jackson invades Florida. The Spanish territory, they're operating criminals, as he calls them, are operating out of Florida into the Alabama territory and the Georgia territory. He goes down there to get them out the way. They move back into Florida, thumb their nose at him, and he decides to invade Florida. It creates an international crisis. But as a result of that, the United States buys Florida from Spain. If we had not won the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson wouldn't have been there to do that. What would have happened to the Florida territories? Would have remained under Spain? When you look at what happens in Texas, Mexican secession, all of these territories are added later on as a consequence of the Louisiana Purchase, the expansion of the United States into this area and the power of the United States. If this is all foreign territory, what happens here? So you can legitimately ask yourself a lot of questions about the idea of America becoming a continental power and the implications of that. As a continental power, the land was available. Jefferson wanted the Louisiana Purchase not only because it gave him control of the Mississippi River in the city of New Orleans, but he was a small d Democrat. He believed that the heart of democracy, just as the heart of what was the Republic of ancient Rome, was a small farmer. These are the fiercely independent people that'll keep a democracy thriving and alive. He saw already in the urban areas the growth of concentrations of people, distribution of wealth, the separation of wealth and classes, working classes coming up. As long as you had vast open territories for people to come into and establish themselves as small farmers, you have the capacity to maintain democracy. It also opened the door for immigrants to come in, because they could flow into the United States and become independent farmers and become independent people. And this constant revitalization of the American spirit is directly tied to this open frontier and these open territories, which might not have existed had the Louisiana Purchase not taken place. And consider all the states that grew out of that, including Louisiana, could have been repudiated. The frontier spirit was defined best by Frederick Jackson Turner. He's an historian who quoted, it was in 1880 when the Census Bureau declared that the American frontier was officially closed. There were no longer available lands for people just to move into. But Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis is fundamentally that the sense of frontier is what vitalized the American people, this fierce independence, this don't tread on me attitude that's become so much a part of who we are and what we are. You know, the fact that when you're out there, I don't know if you've ever seen these things like the guys living off the grid in Alaska and things like that, these people can't depend on anybody but themselves and their own wherewithal, and that was the spirit what made America what it was. That's what the problem, I believe, is when the British ran into the people here in Louisiana in the Battle of New Orleans. You know, they had dealt with people in New England, Butler's Bladensburg. They had dealt with people in the South, but America didn't have two cultures, a North and a South. It had another culture, a Western culture. The frontiersman, with his Kentucky long rifle, his tomahawk, his possibles bag, his hunting dog. This is a guy you didn't mess with. This was, as I kind of comically refer to it, as Duck Dynasty. You know, you don't really mess with these types of people. And that's what they discovered when they found out that they weren't going to run away. They run away from nothing. And that was whole part of the institution of the frontier that built a sense of spirit in these people. It carries to this day in the attitudes that we have about our country and about our attitudes towards life. It was all instilled in us through this frontier spirit, as Frederick Jackson Turner referenced it. Then America becomes a continental power. How important is that when you sit down and consider it? The consequences are absolutely immeasurable. Now I'm going to mention someone's name who's by all means not popular. But even a broken clock is right twice a day. I'm talking about Mein Kampf. Why was Hitler so intent on expanding eastward in Lebensraum to establish what he called living space. If you read Mein Kampf, he talks about empires that are based on their foundation as pyramids and empires that are based on their apex as a pyramid. Those mounted on the apex by nature fall over because they're unstable. Meaning, if you are dependent upon colonies for the resources you need to be what you are, you will fall down because colonies of their nature seek independence. If, however, you occupy all the resources you need to be what you are within your territorial confines, you are a stable empire. He considered Russia stable. He considered America stable. He considered China stable. He wanted Germany to likewise be stable. Because of this Western expansion, and we'd become a continental power, surrounded by oceans on either side, just as the English Channel protected Great Britain. We didn't need a wall. We had oceans protecting us. We had all the resources we needed to be great. We didn't have to reach out and find colonies for resources. They were all here. So once that had been achieved, when you sit down and you think about World War I and World War II, the United States had the capacity to be the national power it was and the savior of democracy it was because it had all the resources it needed and the manufacturing ability to build the weapons of war and that unique American spirit and that quest for democracy all pulling together for this drive for freedom, which in essence, when you consider it, after World War I, those monarchies that are left are gone. You have democracy springing up all over the place. And it's through the fact that the United States had the capacity to pull this all together is what allowed that to happen. Would that have happened had we lost the Battle of New Orleans? Would that have happened if we had lost the Louisiana Purchase? Could that have happened if the Western expansion had not taken place? So when you start fantasizing about these things and considering them, it really makes you wonder just exactly what would the world be like had things been different right out here in Chalmette, just what, 1.5 miles away. That's the importance of the Battle of New Orleans, in my view. This is what America is today. We're actually a world empire when you look at all the areas about, you know. Alaska, the resources here, the resources here. We really don't have any need to be dependent upon anybody. We choose to be. But we don't have to be. Sit down and look at oil, coal, resources. U.S. has the world's largest coal reserves, 491 billion, 27% of the world's coal. We have more oil than anybody else. We're just really discovering it. With new technologies, we're discovering even more. We don't need oil from the Middle East. We could start exporting it if we chose to. You know, we have the industrial capacity. We have the labor force. We have all we need here, and it's a result of what happened out there, okay? Manufacturing, agriculture, seafood, high-tech, ports, everything you can possibly imagine. The world's largest economy, I put a question mark because it's a toss-up between us and China right now. You know, but China has its own issues it's contending with, deep-seated issues that, you know, not unless you start really digging into it, you don't realize what's really happening there. As again, isolation protected by 2 oceans. And this here is just a map of all the resources that are available in the United States. So this was brief, but the conclusion basically is it overstating the case to say that the victorious battle in the Battle of New Orleans was an essential ingredient for Western expansion? And if it was, then the history of the United States is different because you question with Western expansion the issue of slavery. You then get into the Civil War. Would it or would not have happened? The Civil War is legally, under Lincoln, welded us into one United States, the United States, not these United States. That occurred because of the Congress of Vienna, which ended Napoleonic wars, America was no longer distracted or threatened by outside forces. We devoted ourselves totally to internal devices to pull ourselves together domestically as this nationwide continental power. And as that continental power grew and became powerful, it then had an influence on the world, and I think in a very incredibly powerful sense in the 20th century. And as it comes up again, if true, then the entire history of the United States in January 8th, 1815 can be attributed to the victory of New Orleans. And in many ways, the course of events in the entire world are tied together. It's like that little game they call it, Jenga. Is that what it is, with the little sticks all piled up? If you turn around and take 1812 and slide it out, does not the whole thing collapse? That's the question. I know it was brief, it was short, but thank you very much. Could everybody hear that question? Because it'd be difficult to repeat it. It's a bit long, but the issue was pertaining to slavery. Well, after the War of 1812, when Livingston went on the Tunnet and was discussing the exchanges of prisoners, he requested having the slaves returned. And the British were very strongly opposed to slavery ever since Wilberforce, if I'm not mistaken. And as a result, he said, if they want to go, they can, but it's their choice. So you raise an interesting question, because if the British, who were strongly anti-slavery, occupied the Mississippi Valley, how many slaves would have defected to the British lines? If we lost those states west of the Appalachian Mountains because they needed access to the Mississippi River, would they have had to surrender the institution of slavery to have been welcome to have access to the Mississippi River in the city of New Orleans? That would have been a decision in the hands of the Spanish and the British, and we know what the British perspective is. So yeah, you raise some very interesting questions. Just on the issue of slavery itself, what would have been the impact of Great Britain occupying nearly half the United States, or what was the United States? So yeah, that's another ingredient that you have to add in, and the implications of that for American history are profound. What's that? I grew up in my backyard. I use it in class. Well, who picks the cotton? Well, you know, you have the issue of emancipation, compensated emancipation. You just say basically they're not slaves anymore, they're freemen, but you have to pay them. You know, so it becomes a labor force. A lot of people don't realize, but as I appreciate it, that's how the Italians came into Louisiana. After the end of the Civil War, the question was the slaves had been freed. What are you going to use for a labor force? So they reached Sicily, which was devastated at the time, and they started bringing Sicilians, because you can't confuse them with Italians, as I appreciate it, Sicilians, you know, into Louisiana intentionally, to replace that labor force. So if there's a need for labor to be done, that labor would be done, but I don't think it would have been done under the banner of slavery if it was under British territory or under any British control. And I think Tim's probably a better representative of that than I would be.
No, absolutely. You're right, Ron. On the Wilberforce and Pitt the Younger, obviously very much supported by Charles James Fox, 1808 was the basis of the abolition of slavery. It did take till 1833 for Britain to work out how to get rid of it within the empire, which they did with compensation, far cheaper than having a war about it. No, there is no way that Britain could, even if somebody had wanted to, take over a vast swathe of America and reintroduce slavery. That would have been political suicide at home.
There you go.
Incidentally, about the Sicilians, just a little thing. You know, the first big Sicilian group that arrived here was 1861 on the ship the Elisabetta. It was a result of the Risorgimento, when the Bourbon Kingdom of Naples, or two Sicilies, was destroyed, and it's basically members of the Neapolitan army that started here. And as you say, quite rightly, they would take anything because they just had to leave.
They just had to leave. Also, you have the fact that Abraham Lincoln was talking about compensated emancipation as well. He was opposed to slavery, but he wasn't an abolitionist per se. It'll be immediately abolished. He saw gradualism in the idea of compensated emancipation. Pay them, because slaves were expensive. You know, if you look back at the 1840s, a field hand was $740. In today's currency, that's $12,000 to $14,000. That's an expensive commodity. So if somebody takes a slave owner and tells them, well, you've got 10 slaves, I'll give you $12,000 for each one, but then you just have to pay them, that might not be that bad of a deal, and you also don't have to worry about threats of slave rebellions and all this sort of stuff. So it might have legally been able to work its way out. Yes, sir.
I can say about 3 or 4 things, and then you comment on them.
By all means.
First is I want to say I really like the brief lecture, and as you said, it is brief. To get to your point about slavery, okay, I'm a retired Marine.
Thank you for your service, sir.
And there's a lot of values in there, and it's not on our backs that we have a nation today. It's because we have a nation that we were able to serve, just like you were saying. I thought about it when I saw the syllabus for this year, and like for this lecture. If the British had won the battle, and as covered, they probably would have given it back to Spain. And I don't see the British so much as halting American expansion to the Mississippi. However, one of the reasons that Jefferson went into negotiation for the Treaty of New Orleans was to have passage through the river so we didn't have to pay extra. As in the campaign this year, everybody's
That's
talking
right.
about tariffs. And we had to pay extra to the Spanish and the French, whoever owned New Orleans, to move our ship and our product. So therefore, I think we would have still expanded because the British had enough problems with their colonial holdings around the world. They didn't have a military force. They did have the Indians. I think they would have done something like what Powhatan wanted in, say, the Great Northern Plains, like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. They would have had the Indians stay up there and push most of any expansion from the Northwest Territory. Say we might have had Indianapolis. That would have been about it. We would have came westward, and we would have still had slavery because slavery was throughout the nation at that time.
So what's the question? I'm sorry. I didn't hear what was the question.
That's right. It's interesting, though. Is
2 points that just things I've observed about it and thinking about it. Since we had slavery throughout the entire United States at that time, we would have been much more condensed. The issue of abolition would have probably been there. And what would have happened, I don't know. The worst that would have happened, though, and this sometimes things hit me like a light bulb. Tell me what you think, sir. If we would have had a civil war in 1861, had the battle of New Orleans been won by the British, and everything west of the Mississippi, just like you explained, would have been basically the British and Indian hands. The British, who were favorable to the Southern cause in the first place, had they not taken over, like you had said, the agricultural states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, they would have sided with anybody in the South if it was a North and South issue, as it became in 1861. At that time, it wouldn't have mattered. They would have let us eat ourselves up because, just like you said, we would not have had an industrial revolution because we would not have been able to expand along the Great Lakes. We would not have been westward to mine for anything. So basically, our whole American experiment would have been gone then. And anything other than that, if we would have survived any Civil War or survived, just like you had said, sir, it's like World War I, World War II, and us, as when we know the United States today, we wouldn't have been under the 48-star flag in 1970 or 1944. I think we would have eventually went that way because of things happening within the British Empire. And eventually we may have just kind of transitioned out westward. It wouldn't have been manifest destiny. And that's what why am I going on about this? Because
Okay, thank you. Let's get that. I tell you what we'll do is, just because after this, we're going right to the panel discussion. Greatly appreciate your idea, but it's just not on video. We're not getting it. So why don't we do this where, for ideas, we'll give you a chance to get up on the video and express it after this. If there's more.
I appreciate your comments, and I fully agree with you, but what you raise is, when you're raising all these questions, you demonstrate there are so many questions. We have no idea how it would have worked out, but we do know it would have been entirely different. I really believe that. Chris?
So I have a panel discussion for all those questions.
Yes.
Question. Had the British won and Louisiana had returned to Spain, we've kind of dropped that whole Hartford Convention idea because they packed their bags and went home because it was a moot point.
Right.
What impact would a loss at New Orleans have had
Well, now that's a good point, because...
on the Hartford Convention idea?
Well, the Hartford Convention was basically about ending the war. So the war would have been over with. So they would basically have achieved their goal. And they may have hung around and grabbed credit for it. They wouldn't have slunked into the darkness, you know, with their heads down because of this great victory in Chalmette. It would have just proved that they were right all along. So yeah, in that case, it may have altered the domestic politics of the United States, because those elements would have then been their voices would have been much more powerful, because they would have been right all along. Be thankful for what you have. See what this war has cost us. We've now lost Louisiana. Congratulations, Mr. Madison. You know, so yeah, this is another element. So when you start opening this Pandora's box of what ifs, there's really no telling what's going to come out of it. You know, you can't anticipate the future. But again, repeating what I had said to the gentleman over here, it opens the door for speculation, but we know things wouldn't be the same at all.
Because the gentleman this morning was asking about, well, had Louisiana territory been taken away, would we have fought to get it back? In which case, that would have...
I don't think so.
Convention, even more of an impetus to say, you're continuing this war, but with a different group.
Right. We couldn't have continued the war because they had a peace treaty. First of all, Great Britain would now occupy Canada, New Orleans, and the entire Mississippi River. As Tim said, reinforcements would have come in. Now, I thought what was interesting when Tim was referencing was Waterloo, you know, because that was a spin on it. I was going, no, that's something I didn't think about. You know, what happens then? And as Great Britain just basically say, you know, like Pontius Pilate, well, so much with Europe, let me look over this way and see what profits are there. In which case, now Louisiana has a much bigger interest for Great Britain and much more important to hold on to, even if it's technically in Spanish hands legally, it's more or less being policed by the British Army, and cotton is flowing into the British coffers, and the manufacturers are ecstatic about the profits that are coming in because they're paying so little for it. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, Louisiana Purchase, we discussed the legality of Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson had already commissioned Lewis and Clark to explore the West, and he never knew where the boundaries were. But when the Louisiana Purchase, he felt a lot freer to go that way because he never knew where the
They never knew what the boundaries were.
so they were already going to start to go toward the West.
Well, they were looking. That's what the Lewis and Clark expedition was all about. He said it. I mean, they could have been hung as spies, because technically he sent them into foreign territory. You know, it was kind of a surprise to him when the Louisiana Purchase came about, because it was a sudden turn of events predicated on what happened in Haiti and the threats of the British to bring an invasion force in, and Napoleon felt like, well, I don't have the capacity to come. I'm not going to lose any more people. I lost 30,000 people. My brother-in-law in Haiti, Rochambeau, was asking for 40,000 more, and he's like, oh, Haiti's not worth 70,000 men to me, frankly, so I can't use that as a stepping stone to go and occupy New Orleans. The British are going to take it away, and I'm going to get nothing for it. I'm flipping it and selling it and see what I can get for it. But when they sold it, and when Robert Livingston and Monroe were discussing it, they said, well, what are the western borders? And Napoleon's perspective was, I don't know, have no clue. You get what I got. I never did figure out what I got. You work it out with Spain. And in fact, the western border of Louisiana up to the Sabine River is not firmly determined until Jackson attacks Florida. Florida is sold to the United States. And we said, well, while you're at it, why don't you throw in up to the Sabine River in Louisiana? Louisiana became a state with unclear boundaries. Imagine that. That's absolutely insane. That's like buying a piece of property with a house and you say, well, where's the survey? You know, it's kind of here, it's kind of there. You think twice about it. And that's exactly what the problem was, both with purchasing Louisiana and with Louisiana statehood. If you read into Louisiana statehood, it's really interesting. And in fact, Massachusetts, the representative from Massachusetts, threatened to secede from the Union if Louisiana came in.
You have to think like the French do. They think in long lots. They don't care what's behind. They only know how much coastline.
Thank you so much.